Hello and welcome to the next episode of our series on Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Today we are going to finish Engels' epic novel on Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Chapter 3 is on historical materialism, and this is a longer chapter, so we were probably going to be on for a little longer than the last two, but it's a good one. It's a doozy, but it's a good one. It's packed with a lot of good stuff, and if anyone has any questions along the way, feel free to leave some questions in the chat or any topics for discussion along the way. But yeah, I guess some noteworthy stuff to recap from the first two chapters. In the first chapter, he goes into explaining how classes came to be. He introduces the concept of socialism and how it developed as a response to um, class formation and this sort of natural angst that comes about because of class antagonisms that arise because of conflicts of interest, basically. Conflicting interests between the proletarian class and the bourgeois class. And the utopian concept of socialism being this idea of there being an understanding that society can do better than capitalism, or at least a wanting for it, a yearning for better than, or rather than capitalism, but not really knowing enough about the workings of capitalism to identify what was wrong with it, or how it worked. And in the second chapter, he goes into more of the philosophy and the conceptual underpinnings of Marxism, and he does that as a way of laying the groundwork for what the basis is for Marxism and where, like, how it uses this methodology to essentially to work through a process whereby it can ascertain truth, and using this methodology, it can turn socialism into it can turn it from this utopian concept into a scientific concept, and that's precisely what they did. Marx, by using what we learned in the last chapter, dialectical materialism, and what we're going to talk about in this chapter, historical materialism, which is basically just a philosophical way of looking at the world, in that you have to look at things within the physical reality that they exist, and also understanding that the world is a dynamic and changing place, that things are not not fixed and isolated from their environment. They are experiencing forces that are acting on them and changing them at every point in time. And unless you can take those things into account, and unless you do take those things into account, you're not going to be able to understand things properly, or in any meaningful way or any useful way. And so when he did that with both history, when he did that with history, he developed this concept called historical materialism, and through that he um, understood that history can be understood through the lens of a class struggle. That it's class struggle that um, has determined the phases in society, the changes that society has undergone over periods of time, and then um, doing that with economic theory, he was able to understand capitalism to the extent where he understood this concept of surplus value, where you can have a the separation of classes of the working class and the elites, or as the terms that they use, the proletarian class and the bourgeois class. Um, uh, the reason why you can have that is because there is this surplus value that is created during labor, and basically the bosses pocket the surplus value and they don't work. And it's pretty much that simple. And we'll talk more about that today as we read through the chapter. But it's important to at least highlight some of these points so that we um, recognize them as they come up, because they this is an old text, and that's part of the reason why I want to read it aloud and kind of give it a bit of life, because I recognize that it can be a little difficult to take in, and it's easier to either hear it and have someone that understands it or has read it before, and ideally, as this channel goes on for a while, there's more of a discussion going on, and there's questions coming in, and there's more of a dialogue. That would be the ideal future for the channel, because these are ideas that I think are important to understand, to discuss, and to reveal to society, honestly, because I think it's something that a lot of people don't really have a conscious understanding of. It's not the way that we understand our role in society, and the way that we conceive of our work. Like when we go to work from day to day, we don't really think of our jobs in this way. But the concepts are there, the dynamics are there, and it's important for us to understand them, and to be aware of them, and we'll get into other books and other texts and other ideas that are a little bit more involved, and highlight more of may feel a little bit more either actionable, or more like, or even more theoretical, and more for discussion. But it would be great to have this as more of a forum to discuss these things, and hopefully as a way for people to get something out of these texts, because I know the first time that I read this specific text, for me, was eye-opening, and this last chapter was particularly eye-opening for me. So I'm hoping that it has that same effect for you guys, and I guess with that I'll get to it. But again, if you guys have any questions or have anything that comes up during the reading, then feel free to put it into the chat. So, Part 3, Historical Materialism. The materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life and, next to production, the exchange of things produced, is the basis of all social structure, that in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in men's better insights into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. They are to be sought not in the philosophy, but in the economics of each particular epoch. The growing perception that existing social institutions are unreasonable and unjust, that reason has become unreason and right wrong, is only proof that in the modes of production and exchange, changes have silently taken place with which the social order, adapted to earlier economic conditions, is no longer in keeping. From this it also follows that the means of getting rid of the incongruities that have been brought to light must also be present, in a more or less developed condition, within the change modes of production themselves. These means are not to be invented by deduction from fundamental principles, but are to be discovered in the stubborn facts of the existing system of production. What is, then, the position of modern socialism in this connection? The present situation of society, this is now pretty generally conceded, is the creation of the ruling class of today, the bourgeoisie. The mode of production peculiar to the bourgeoisie, known since Marx as the capitalist mode of production, was incompatible with the feudal system, with the privileges it conferred upon individuals, entire social ranks and local corporations, as well as the hereditary ties of subordination which constituted the framework of its social organization. The bourgeoisie broke up the feudal system and built upon its ruins the capitalist order of society, the kingdom of free competition, of personal liberty, of the equality before the law, of all commodity owners, of all the rest of the capitalist blessings. Thenceforward, the capitalist mode of production could develop in freedom, since steam, machinery, and the making of machines by machinery transformed the older manufacture into modern industry. The productive forces evolved under the guidance of the bourgeoisie, developed with a rapidity and in a degree unheard of before. But just as the older manufacture, in its time, and handicraft becoming more developed under its influence, had come into collision with the feudal trammels of the guilds, so now modern industry, in its complete development, comes into collision with the bounds within which the capitalist mode of production holds it confined. The new productive forces have already outgrown the capitalistic mode of using them, and this conflict between productive forces and modes of production is not a conflict engendered in the mind of man, but that between original sin and divine justice. It exists, in fact, objectively outside us, independently of the will and actions even of the men that have brought it on. Modern socialism is nothing but the reflex in thought of the conflict in fact, its ideal reflection in the minds first of the class directly suffering under it, the working class. Now, in what does this conflict consist? Before capitalist production, i.e., in the Middle Ages, the system of petty industry obtained generally based upon the private property of the laborers and the means of production in the country, the agriculture of the small peasant, freeman, or serf, in the towns, the handicrafts, organized in guilds, the instruments of labor, land, agricultural implements, the workshop, the tool, were the instruments of labor of single individuals, adapted for the use of one worker, and therefore of necessity small, dwarfish, circumscribed. But for this very reason, they belonged as a rule to the producer himself. To concentrate these scattered, limited means of production, to enlarge them, to turn them into the powerful levers of production of the present day. This was precisely the historic role of capitalist production and of its upholder, the bourgeoisie. In the fourth section of Capital, Marx has explained in detail how since the 15th century this has been historically worked out through three phases of simple cooperation, manufacture, and modern industry. But the bourgeoisie, as is shown there, could not transform these puny means of production into mighty productive forces without transforming them at the same time from means of production of the individual into social means of production only workable by a collectivity of men. The spinning wheel, the hand loom, the blacksmith's hammer were replaced by the spinning machine, the power loom, the steam hammer. The individual workshop by the factory, implying the cooperation of hundreds and thousands of workmen. In like manner, production itself changed from a series of individual into a series of social acts, and the production from individual to social products. The yarn, the cloth, the metal articles that now come out of the factory were the joint product of many workers, through whose hands they had successively to pass before they were ready. No one person could say of them, "I made that. This is my product." But where in a given society the fundamental form of production is that spontaneous division of labor which creeps in gradually and not upon any preconceived plan, there the product take on the form of commodities, whose mutual exchange, buying and selling, enable the individual producers to satisfy their manifold wants. And this was the case in the Middle Ages. The peasant, for example, sold to the artisan agricultural products and bought from him the products of handicraft. Into the society of individual producers, of commodity producers, the new mode of production thrust itself. In the midst of the old division of labor, grown up spontaneously and upon no definite plan, which had governed the whole of society, now arose division of labor upon a definite plan, as organized in the factory. Side by side with individual production appeared social production. The products of both were sold in the same market, and therefore at prices at least approximately equal. But organization upon a definite plan was stronger than spontaneous division of labor. The factories, working with the combined social forces of a collectivity of individuals, produced their commodities far more cheaply than the individual small producers. Individual producers succumbed in one department after another. Socialized production revolutionized all the old methods of production, but its revolutionary character was at the same time so little recognized that it was, on the contrary, introduced as a means of increasing and developing the production of commodities. When it arose, it found ready-made and made liberal use of certain machinery for the production and exchange of commodities, merchants' capital, handicraft, wage labor. Socialized production, thus introducing itself as a new form of the production of commodities, It was a matter of course that under it the old forms of appropriation remained in full swing and were applied to its products as well. In the medieval stage of evolution of the production of commodities, the question as to the owner of the product of labor could not arise. The individual producer, as a rule, had, from raw materials belonging to himself, and generally his own handiwork, produced it with his own tools, by the labor of his own hands or of his family. There was no need for him to appropriate the new product. It belonged wholly to him, as a matter of course. His property in the product was, therefore, based upon his own labor. Even where external help was used, this was, as a rule, of little importance, and very generally was compensated by something other than wages. The apprentices and journeymen of the guilds worked less for board and wages than for education, in order that they might become master craftsmen themselves. Then came the concentration of the means of production and the producers in large workshops and manufactories, their transformation into actual socialized means of production and socialized producers. But the socialized producers and means of production and their products were still treated, after this change, just as they had been before, i.e., as the means of production and the products of individuals. Hitherto the owner of the instruments of labor had himself appropriated the product, because, as a rule, it was his own product, and the assistance of others was the exception. Now the owner of the instruments of labor always appropriated to himself the product, although it was no longer his product, but exclusively the product of the labor of others. Thus, the products now produced socially were not appropriated by those who had actually set in motion the means of production and actually produced the commodities, but by the capitalists. The means of production and production itself had become in essence socialized, but they were subjected to a form of appropriation which presupposes the private production of individuals, under which, therefore, every one owns his own product and brings it to market. The mode of production is subjected to this form of appropriation, although it abolishes the conditions upon which the latter rests. This contradiction, which gives to the new mode of production its capitalistic character, contains the germ of the whole of the social antagonisms of today. The greater the mastery obtained by the new mode of production over all important fields of production and in all manufacturing countries, the more it reduced individual production to an insignificant residuum, the more clearly was brought out the incompatibility of socialized production with capitalistic appropriation. The first capitalist found, as we have said, alongside with other forms of labor, wage labor readily made for them on the market. But it was exceptional, complementary, accessory, transitory wage labor. The agricultural laborer, though upon occasion he hired himself out of the day, had a few acres of his own land on which he could at all events live at a pinch. The guilds were so organized that the journeyman of today became the master of tomorrow. But all this changed as soon as the means of production became socialized and concentrated in the hands of the capitalists. The means of production, as well as the product of the individual producer, became more and more worthless. There was nothing left for him but to turn wage worker under the capitalist. Wage labor, aforetime the exception and accessory, now became the rule and basis of all production. Aforetime complementary, it now became the sole remaining function of the worker. The wage worker for a time became a wage worker for life. The number of these permanent was further enormously increased by the breaking up of the feudal system that occurred at the same time by the disbanding of the retainers of the feudal lords. the eviction of the peasants from their homesteads, etc. The separation was made complete between the means of production concentrated in the hands of the capitalists on the one side and producers possessing nothing but their labor power on the other. The contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation manifested itself as the antagonism of proletariat and bourgeoisie. We have seen that the capitalistic mode of production thrust its way into a society of commodity producers, of individual producers whose social bond was the exchange of their products. But every society based upon the production of commodities has this peculiarity, that the producers have lost control over their own social interrelations. Each man produces for himself with such means of production as he may happen to have, and for such exchange as he may require to satisfy his remaining wants. No one knows how much of his particular article is coming on the market, nor how much of it will be wanted. No one knows whether his individual product will meet an actual demand, whether he will be able to make good his cost of production or even to sell his commodity at all. Anarchy reigns in socialized production. But the production of commodities, like every other form of production, has its peculiar inherent laws inseparable from it, and these laws work despite anarchy in and through anarchy. They reveal themselves in the only persistent form of social interrelations, i.e., in exchange, and here they affect the individual producers as compulsory laws of competition. They are, at first, unknown to these producers themselves, and have to be discovered by them gradually as the result of experience. They work themselves out, therefore, independently of the producers, and in antagonism to them, and inexorable natural laws of their particular form of production. The product governs the producers. In medieval society, especially in the earlier centuries, production was essentially directed towards satisfying the wants of the individual. It satisfied, in the main, only the wants of the producer and his family. Where relations of personal dependence existed, as in the country, it also helped to satisfy the wants of the feudal lord. In all this, there was therefore no exchange. The products, consequently, did not assume the character of commodities. The family of the peasant produced almost everything they wanted, clothes and furniture, as well as the means of subsistence. Only when it began to produce more than was sufficient to supply its own wants and the payments in kind to the feudal lords, only then did it also produce commodities. This surplus, thrown into socialized exchange and offered for sale, became commodities. The artisan in the towns, it is true, had from the first to produce for exchange, but they also themselves supplied the greatest part of their individual wants. They had gardens and plots of land. They turned their cattle out into the communal forest, which also yielded them timber and firing. The women spun flax, wool, and so forth. Production for the purpose of exchange, production of commodities, was only in its infancy. Hence, exchange was restricted, the market narrow, the methods of production stable. There was local exclusiveness without local unity within. The mark in the country, in the town, the guild. But with the extension of the production of commodities, and especially with the introduction of the capitalist mode of production, the laws of commodity production, hitherto latent, came into action more openly and with greater force. The old bonds were loosened, the old exclusive limits broken through. The producers were more and more turned into independent, isolated producers of commodities. It became apparent that the production of society at large was ruled by absence of plan, by accident, by anarchy, and this anarchy grew to greater and greater height. But the chief means of aid, But the chief means by aid of which the capitalist mode of production intensified this anarchy of socialized production was the exact opposite of anarchy. It was the increasing organization of production upon a social basis in every individual productive establishment. By this, the old, peaceful, stable condition of things was ended. Wherever this organization of production was introduced into a branch of industry, it brooked no other method of production by its side. The field of labor became a battleground. The great geographical discoveries and the colonization followed them, multiplied markets and quickened the transformation of handicraft into manufacture. The war did not simply break out between the individual producers of particular localities. The local struggles begat, in their turn, national conflicts, the commercial wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. Finally, modern industry and the opening of the world market made the struggle universal, and at the same time gave it an unheard of virulence. Advantages in natural or artificial conditions of production now decide the existence or non-existence of individual capitalists as well as of whole industries and countries. He that falls is remorselessly cast aside. It is the Darwinian struggle of the individual for existence transferred from nature to society with intensified violence. The conditions of existence natural to the animal appear as the final term of human development. The contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation now presents itself as an antagonism between the organization of production in the individual workshop and the anarchy of production in society generally. The capitalistic mode of production moves in these two forms of the antagonism immanent to it from its very origin. It is never able to get out of that vicious cycle which Fourier had already discovered. What Fourier could not indeed see in his time is that this circle is gradually narrowing, that the movement becomes more and more spiral, and that must come to an end, like the movement of planets, by collision with the center. It is the compelling force of anarchy in the production of society at large that more and more completely turns the great majority of men into proletarians, and it is the masses of the proletariat again who will finally put an end to anarchy in production. It is the compelling force of anarchy in social production that turns the limitless perfectibility of machinery under modern industry into a compulsory law by which every individual industrial capitalist must perfect his machinery more and more under penalty of ruin. But the perfecting of machinery is making human labor superfluous. If the introduction and increase of machinery means the displacement of millions of manual by a few machine workers, improvement in machinery means the displacement of more and more of the machine workers themselves. It means, in the last instance, the production of a number of available wage workers in excess of the average needs of capital, the formation of a complete industrial reserve army, as I called it in 1845, available at the times when industry is working at high pressure, to be cast out upon the street when the inevitable crash comes, a constant dead weight upon the limbs of the working class in its struggle for existence with capital, a regulator for keeping of wages down to the low level that suits the interests of capital. Thus it comes about, to quote Marx, that machinery becomes the most powerful weapon in the war of capital against the working class, that the instruments of labor constantly tear the means of subsistence out of the hands of the laborer, that the very product of the worker is turned into an instrument of his subjugation. Thus it comes about that the economizing of the instruments of labor becomes at the same time from the outset the most reckless waste of labor power, the robbery based upon the normal conditions under which labor functions, that machinery, quote, the most powerful instrument of shortening labor time, becomes the most unfailing means of placing every moment of the laborer's time and that of his family at the disposal of the capitalist, for the purpose of expanding the value of his capital. From Capital, page 406. Thus it comes about that the overwork of some becomes the preliminary condition for the idleness of others, and that modern industry, which hunts after new consumers over the whole world, forces the consumption of the masses at home down to a starvation minimum, and in doing thus destroys its own home market. Quote, the law that always equilibrates the relative surplus population or industrial reserve army to the extent and energy of accumulation, this law rivets the laborer to capital more firmly than the wedges of Vulcan did Prometheus to the rock. It establishes an accumulation of misery corresponding with the accumulation of capital. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is, therefore, at the same time accumulation of misery, agony, of turmoil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole, i.e., on the side of the class that produces its own product in the form of capital. That's a quote from Marx's Capital, page 661. And to expect any other division of the products from the capitalist mode of production is the same as expecting the electrodes of a battery not to decompose acidulated water, not to liberate oxygen at the positive, hydrogen at the negative pole, so long as they are connected with the battery. We have seen that the ever-increasing perfectibility of modern machinery is, by the anarchy of social production, turned into a compulsory law that forces the individual industrial capitalist always to improve his machinery, always to increase its productive force. The bare possibility of extending the field of production is transformed for him into a similarly compulsory law. The enormous expansive force of modern industry, compared with which that of gases is mere child's play, appears to us now as a necessity for expansion, both qualitative and quantitative, that laughs at all resistance. Such resistance is offered by consumption, by sales, by the markets, for the products of modern industry. But the capacity for extension, extensive and intensive, of the markets is primarily governed by quite different laws that work much less energetically. The extension of the markets cannot keep pace with the extension of production. The collision becomes inevitable, and as this cannot produce any real solution so long as it does not break in pieces the capitalist mode of production, the collisions become periodic. Capitalist production has begotten another vicious cycle. As a matter of fact, since 1825, when the first general crisis broke out, the whole industrial and commercial world, production and exchange among all civilized peoples and their more or less barbaric hangers-on, are thrown out of joint about once every 10 years. Commerce is at a standstill. The markets are glutted. Products accumulate as multitudinous as they are unsaleable. Hard cash disappears. Credit vanishes. Factories are closed. The mass of the workers are in want of the means of subsistence because they have produced too much of the means of subsistence. Bankruptcy follows upon bankruptcy. Execution upon execution. The stagnation lasts for years. Productive forces and products are wasted and destroyed wholesale until the accumulated mass of commodities finally filter off, more or less depreciated in value until production and exchange gradually begin to move again. Little by little, the pace quickens. It becomes a trot. The industrial trot breaks into a canter. The canter, in turn, grows into the headlong gallop of a perfect steeplechase of industry, commercial credit, and speculation, which finally, after breakneck leaps, ends where it began, in the ditch of a crisis. And so over and over again. We have now, since the year 1825, gone through this 5 times, and at the present moment, in 1877, we are going through it for the 6th time. And the character of these crises is so clearly defined that Fourier hit all of them off when he described the first crisis, plethoric, a crisis from plethora. In these crises, the contradiction between socialized production and capitalist appropriation ends in a violent explosion. The circulation of commodities is for the time being stopped. Money, the means of circulation, becomes a hindrance to circulation. All the laws of production and circulation of commodities are turned upside down. The economic collision has reached its apogee. The mode of production is production in society, which exists side by side with and dominates it, is brought home to the capitalists themselves by the violent concentration of capital that occurs during crises, through the ruin of many large and a still greater number of small capitalists. The whole mechanism of the capitalist mode of production breaks down under the pressure of the productive forces, its own creations. It is no longer able to turn all this mass of means of production into capital. They lie fallow, and for that reason the Industrial Reserve Army must also lie fallow. Means of production, means of subsistence, available laborers, all the elements of production and of general wealth are present in abundance, but abundance becomes the source of distress and want. He's quoting Fourier there. Because it is the very thing that prevents the transformation of the means of production and subsistence into capital. For in capitalistic society, the means of production can only function when they have undergone a preliminary transformation into capital, into the means of exploiting human labor power. The necessity of this transformation into capital, of the means of production and subsistence, stands like a ghost between these and the workers. It alone prevents the coming together of the material and personal levers of production. It alone forbids the means of production to function, the workers to work and live. On the one hand, therefore, the capitalistic mode of production stands convicted of its own incapacity to further direct these productive forces. On the other, these productive forces themselves, with increasing energy, press forward to the removal of the existing contradiction, to the abolition of their quality as capital, to the practical recognition of their character as social production forces. This rebellion of the productive forces, as they grow more and more powerful against their quality as capital, this stronger and stronger command that their social character shall be recognized, forces the capital class itself to treat them more and more as social productive forces. So far as this is possible under capitalist conditions, the period of industrial high pressure, with its unbound inflation of credit, not less than the crash itself, by the collapse of great capitalist establishments, tends to bring about the form of the socialization of great masses of means of production, which we meet with in the different kinds of joint stock companies. Many of these means of production and of distribution are, from the outset, so colossal that, like the railways, they exclude all other forms of capitalistic expansion. At a further stage of evolution, this form also becomes insufficient. The producers on a large scale in a particular branch of an industry, in a particular country unite in a trust, a union for the purpose of regulating production. They determine the total amount to be produced, parcel it out among themselves, and thus enforce the selling price fixed beforehand. But trusts of this kind, as soon as business becomes bad, are generally liable to break up, and on this very account compel a yet greater concentration of association. The whole of a particular industry is turned into one gigantic joint stock company. Internal competition gives place to the internal monopoly of this one company. This has happened in 1890 with the English alkali production, which is now, after the fusion of 48 large works in the hands of one company, conducted upon a single plan and with a capital of £6,000,000. In the trusts, freedom of competition changes into its very opposite, into monopoly, and the production without any definite plan of capitalistic society capitulates to the production upon a definite plan of the invading socialistic society. Certainly, this is so far still to the benefit and advantage of the capitalists. But in this case, the exploitation is so palpable that it must break down. No nation will put up with the production conducted by trusts, with so barefaced an exploitation of the community by a small band of dividend mongers. In any case, with trusts or without, the official representative of capitalist society, the state, will ultimately have to undertake the direction of production. This necessity for conversion into state property is felt first in the great institutions for intercourse and communication, the post office, the telegraphs, the railways. If the crisis demonstrates the incapacity of the bourgeois for managing any longer modern productive forces, the transformation of the great establishments for production and distribution into joint stock companies, trusts, and state property show how unnecessary the bourgeoisie are for that purpose. All the social functions of the capitalist has no further social function than that of pocketing dividends, tearing off coupons, and gambling on the stock exchange, where the different capitalists despoil one another of their capital. At first, the capitalistic mode of production forces out the workers. Now it forces out the capitalists and reduces them, just as it reduced the workers to the ranks of the surplus population, although not immediately into those of the industrial reserve army. But the transformation, either into joint stock companies and trusts or into state ownership, does not do away with the capitalistic nature of the productive forces. In the joint stock companies and trusts, this is obvious, and the modern state, again, is only the organization that bourgeois society takes on in order to support the external conditions of the capitalist mode of production, against the encroachments as well of the workers as of industrial capitalists. The modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine. The state of the capitalist, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist. The more citizens does it exploit. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relation is not done away with. It is rather brought to a head. But brought to a head, it topples over. State ownership of the productive forces is not the solution of the conflict, but concealed within it are the technical conditions that form the elements of that solution. This solution can only consist in the practical recognition of the social nature of modern forces of production, and therefore in the harmonizing with the socialized character of the means of production. And this can only come about by society openly and directly taking possession of the productive forces which have outgrown all control, except that of society as a whole. The social character of the means of production and of the products today reacts against the producers, periodically disrupts all production and exchange, acts only like a law of nature working blindly, forcibly, destructively. But with the taking over by society of the productive forces, the social character of the means of production and of the products will be utilized by the producers with a perfect understanding of its nature, and instead of being a source of disturbance and periodical collapse, collapse will become the most powerful lever of production itself. Active social forces work exactly like natural forces, blindly, forcibly, destructively, so long as we do not understand and reckon with them. But when once we understand them, when once we grasp their action, their direction, their effects, it depends only upon ourselves to subject them more and more to our own will, and, by means of them, to reach our own ends. And this holds quite especially of the mighty productive forces of today. As long as we obstinately refuse to understand the nature and the character of these social means of action, and this understanding goes against the grain of the capitalist mode of production and its defenders, so long these forces are at work in spite of us, in opposition to us, so long they master us, as we have shown above in detail. But when once their nature is understood, they can, in the hands of the producers, work together, be transformed from master demons into willing servants. The difference is as that between the destructive force of electricity in the lightning, in the storm, and electricity under command in the telegraph and the voltaic arc. The difference between the conflagration and fire working in the service of man. With this recognition, at last, of the real nature of the productive forces of today, the social anarchy of production gives place to a social regulation of production upon a definite plan, according to the needs of the community and of each individual. Then the capitalist mode of appropriation, in which the product enslaves first the producer and then the appropriator, is replaced by the mode of appropriation of the products that is based upon the nature of the modern means of production. Upon the one hand, direct social appropriation as means to the maintenance and extension of production. On the other, direct individual appropriation as means of subsistence and of enjoyment. Whilst the capitalist mode of production more and more completely transforms the great majority of the population into proletarians, it creates the power which, under the penalty of its own destruction, is forced to accomplish this revolution. Whilst it forces on more and more of the transformation of the vast means of production already socialized into state property, it shows itself the way of accomplishing this revolution. The proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property. But in doing this, it abolishes itself as proletariat, abolishes all class distinction and class antagonisms, abolishes also the state as state. Society thus far, based upon class antagonisms, had need of the state. That is, of an organization of the particular class which was pro tempore, the exploiting class, an organization of the purpose of preventing any interference from without with the existing conditions of production, and therefore especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited classes in the condition of oppression corresponding with the given mode of production: slavery, serfdom, wage labor. The state was the official representative of society as a whole, the gathering of it together into a visible embodiment. But it was this only insofar as it was the state of that class which itself represented, for the time being, society as a whole. In ancient times, the state of slave-owning citizens. In the Middle Ages, the feudal lords. In our own times, the bourgeoisie. When at last it becomes the real representative of the whole of society, it renders itself unnecessary. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule the individual struggle for existence based upon our present anarchy in production, with the collisions and excesses arising from these, are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed, and a special repressive force, the state, is no longer necessary. The first act by virtue of which the state really constitutes itself the representative of the whole of society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, that is, at the same time, its last independent act as state. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then dies out of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it dies out. This gives the measure of the value of the phrase a free state, both as to its justifiable use at times by agitators and as to its ultimate scientific insufficiency, and also of the demands of the so-called anarchists for the abolition of the state out of hand. Since the historical appearance of the capitalist mode of production, the appropriation of society of all the means of production has often been dreamed of, more and more vaguely, by individuals as well as by sects, as the ideal of the future. But it could become a historical necessity, only when the actual conditions of its realization were there. Like every other social advance, it becomes practicable not by men understanding that the existence of classes is in contradiction to justice, equality, etc., not by the mere willingness to abolish these classes, but by virtue of certain new economic conditions. The separation of society into an exploiting and an exploited class, a ruling and an oppressed class, was the necessary consequence of the deficient. I'll read that again. The separation of society into an exploiting and an exploited class, a ruling and an oppressed class, was the necessary consequences of the deficient and restricted development of production in former times. So long as the total social labor only yields a produce which but slightly exceeds that barely necessary for the existence of all, so long, therefore, as labor engages all or almost all the time of the great majority of the members of society, so long of necessity this society is divided into classes. Side by side with the great majority exclusively bond slaves to labor, arises a class freed from directly productive labor, which looks after the general affairs of society, the direction of labor, state business, law, science, art, etc. It is, therefore, the law of division of labor that lies at the basis of the division into classes. But this does not prevent this division into classes from being carried out by means of violence and robbery, trickery and fraud. It does not prevent the ruling class, once having the upper hand, from consolidating its power at the expense of the working class, from turning its social leadership into an intensified exploitation of the masses. But if, upon this showing, division into classes has a certain historical justification, it has this only for a given period, only under given social conditions. It was based upon the insufficiency of production. It will be swept away by the complete development of modern productive forces. And in fact, the abolition of classes in society presupposes a degree of historical evolution at which the existence not simply of this or that particular ruling class, but of any ruling class at all, and therefore the existence of class distinction itself has become an obsolete anachronism. It presupposes, therefore, the development of production carried out to a degree at which appropriation of the means of production and of the products, and with this the political domination of the monopoly of culture and of intellectual leadership by a particular class of society, has become not only superfluous, but economically, politically, intellectually a hindrance to development. This point is now reached. Their political and intellectual bankruptcy is scarcely any longer a secret to the bourgeois themselves. Their economic bankruptcy recurs regularly every 10 years. In every crisis, society is suffocated beneath the weight of its own productive forces and products, which it cannot use, and stands helpless face to face with the absurd contradiction that the producers have nothing to consume, because consumers are wanting. The expansive force of the means of production bursts the bonds that the capitalist mode of production has imposed upon them. Their deliverance from these bonds is the one precondition for an unbroken, constantly accelerated development of the productive forces, and therewith for the practically unlimited increase of production itself. Nor is this all. The socialized appropriation of the means of production does away not only with the present artificial restrictions upon production, but also with the positive waste and devastation of productive forces and products that are at the present time the inevitable concomitants of production and that reach their height in the crises. Further, it sets free for the community at large a mass of means of production and of products by doing away with the senseless extravagance of the ruling classes of today and their political representatives. The possibility of securing for every member of society, by means of socialized production, an existence not only fully sufficient materially and becoming day by day more full, but an existence guaranteeing to all the free development and exercise of their physical and mental faculties. This possibility is now for the first time here, but it is here. With the seizing of the means of production by society, production of commodities is done away with, and simultaneously the mastery of the product over the producer. Anarchy in social production is replaced by systematic, definite organization. The struggle for the individual existence disappears. Then, for the first time, man in a certain sense, is finally marked off from the rest of the animal kingdom and emerges from mere animal conditions of existence into really human ones. The whole sphere of the conditions of life which environ man and which have hitherto ruled man now comes under the dominion and control of man, whom for the first time becomes the real conscious lord of nature, because he has now become master of his own social organization. The laws of his own social action, hitherto standing face to face with man as laws of nature, foreign to and dominating him, will then be used with full understanding and so mastered by him. Man's own social organization, hitherto confronting him as a necessity imposed by nature and history, now becomes the result of his own free action. The extraneous objective forces that have hitherto governed history pass under the control of man himself. Only from that time will man himself more and more consciously make his own history. Only from that time will the social causes set in movement by him have, in the main and in a constantly growing measure, the results intended by him. It is the ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. Let us briefly sum up our sketch of historical evolution. First, medieval society. Individual production on a small scale. Means of production adapted for individual use, hence primitive, ungainly, petty dwarfed inaction, production for immediate consumption, either of the producer himself or of his feudal lord. Only where an excess of production over this consumption occurs is such excess offered for sale, enters into exchange. Production of commodities, therefore, only in its infancy, but already it contains within itself, in embryo, anarchy and the production of society at large. 2. Capitalist revolution. Transformation of industry, at first be means of simple cooperation and manufacture, concentration of the means of production hitherto scattered into great workshops. As a consequence, their transformation from individual to social means of production, a transformation which does not, on the whole, affect the form of exchange. The old forms of appropriation remain in force. The capitalist appears in his capacity as owner of the means of production. He also appropriates the products and turns them into commodities. Production has become a social act. Exchange and appropriation continue to be individual acts and acts of individuals. The social product is appropriated by the individual capitalist. Fundamental contradiction, whence arise all the contradictions in which our present-day society moves and which modern industry brings to light. And Part 2, subsection A, severance of the producer from the means of production, condemnation of the worker to wage labor for life, antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Subsection B, growing predominance and increasing effectiveness of the laws governing the production of commodities, unbridled competition, contradiction between socialized organization and the individual factory, and social anarchy in the production as a whole. Subsection C, on the one hand, perfecting of machinery made by competition, compulsory for each individual manufacturer, and complemented by the constantly growing displacement of laborers, industrial reserve army. On the other hand, unlimited extension of production, also compulsory under competition for every manufacturer. On both sides, unheard of development of productive forces, excessive supply over demand, overproduction of products, excess thereof of laborers, without employment and without means of existence. But these two levers of production and of social well-being are unable to work together because the capitalist form of production prevents the productive forces from working and the products from circulating unless they are first turned into capital, which their very superabundance prevents. The contradiction has grown into an absurdity. The mode of production arises in rebellion against the form of exchange. Subsection D, partial recognition of the social character of the productive forces forced upon the capitalists themselves, taking over the great institutions for production and communication, first by joint stock companies, later by the trusts, then by the state. The bourgeois demonstrated to the superfluous class. All its social functions are now performed by salaried employees. And Part 3, Proletarian Revolution. Solution of the contradictions. The proletariat seizes the public power and by means of this transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property. By this act, the proletariat frees the means of production from the character of capital they have thus far borne, and gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon a predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. The development of production makes the existence of different classes of society thenceforth an anachronism. In proportion as anarchy in social production vanishes, the political authority of the state dies out. Man, at last the master of his own form of social organization, becomes at the same time the lord over nature, his own master, free. To accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. To thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions and thus the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish, this is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism. And that is the end. Stay on for a second to see if anyone has any questions. But yeah, I think he does a pretty decent job at outlining the I mean, I really enjoyed this. I'm sorry if I don't think that I rushed through it, and I felt like I did a pretty decent pace. But let me see if there's anything that I want to highlight. I mean, he does a pretty good job at explaining how you go from feudalism to capitalism. And how there's this social character to even within the capitalist mode of production. There's a socialized character to the way that industry operates, which is interesting because the amount of machinery that is incorporated into the capitalist mode of production and the division of labor kind of works against part of what makes the capitalist mode of production have that socialized character, because the more you divide the labor, you take that away from it. You take away the ability for people to be more creative and involved in the different processes that are involved in the production of commodities. And with that, so part of where I'm going with that is this idea of like conceptualizing what it would be like to live in like a socialist society. And there are some allusions here to what that would be like. And the truth is that in some respects, there's two ways to answer that. In a lot of ways, it would be very similar to what we have today, because we're already doing the jobs that theoretically we would continue to do. It would just be a democratic way of organizing production. It would be democratically worked out by the workers themselves, rather than this dictatorship of the CEOs, where you have, people at the top deciding what we do, whether we like it or not. That's essentially what we have now. That is exactly what we have now. Instead of that, and he really hits home with this idea of anarchy. And it's anarchy only in that there's no um, regulation over, like, it's funny, and I laugh because we have this concept in the U.S. of freedom, but it gets conflated, and I feel like deliberately so. Like the concepts of like individual freedoms, um, and the legal distinction between the freedom of the individual and the freedom of the corporation, are deliberately murky, um, in that, like, corporations are legal entities, and they have freedoms, like conceptual freedoms, the same way that individuals do. Um, and um, a lot of the times when we think of, um, the U.S. being the advocate for freedom, liberty, and democracy, um, what we're what is really being advocated for there is less the freedom of individuals as people and more the freedom of corporations and companies and CEOs to do as they please in terms of their business practices. Uh, so in that regard, the existence of governments becomes superfluous. Just because governments exist, it they're just technically there. They don't really they like the whole point of us being an advocate for freedom is to make sure that these governments don't get in the way of of companies running as they please. And so in that regard, you have an effective anarchy. Um, so he's right to describe it in those particular terms, um, because that's what ends up happening. Um, and so to circle back to this point of, what it would be like under socialism, instead of having, you know, the the like when we talk about the means of production, what we're really getting at is what are we working on? Like, okay, we have a job. Like, say you're a worker and you have a job at Company X, um, and Company X is a maker of cars, right? And um, the CEO is a capitalist, and he wants because he's just that kind of guy. He wants them to run on gas, even though there's the technology to make them run on electricity or solar powered cars, or just completely carbon neutral, right? Theoretically, I'm just giving a hypothetical here. Um, so the difference here that I'm presenting here as a hypothetical of what the difference in socialism would be is, rather than having this one guy decide what the company is going to produce, you could say, why don't we vote on it? Let's just everyone get together, everyone in the company, or set up some sort of system where we have a way where we vote on it. Maybe it's not just everyone in the company. Maybe it's, we have representatives, within the company. There are people from the trade union that we're a part of that get a vote. Maybe there are people from the government that get a vote, so that it's like, you know, that way there's like a democratic process that incorporates like the the workers at other companies, and also the you know just general members of society get a vote, and also the people who are literally making the cars themselves get a vote. That way, it's not exclusively the people who are making the cars that are getting a vote, but like a mixture. It's like a representative vote, of the different people who are going to be affected by the decision of how these cars are made, or what kind of cars get made. Um, if you create some sort of election process where you take into account the different um, uh, uh, people who are affected by this decision, um, and you vote. Okay, how are we going to design this car? Are we going to design it to be carbon neutral, or are we going to design it to be run on gas? Because we know the effects of gas. If you left it to the whim of this one guy, we know where that leads. If we made a democratic decision, I think we'd probably decide something different, or at least we'd have a debate. We'd be able to talk about it. We'd have a conversation. And so there's that aspect of it, of what it would be like under socialism. So you have, so in that way it would both be very different, because obviously you have a vested interest in the decision. You have more decision making capacity over what is actually happening, both at your company and potentially at other companies, in your community, um, and you. But at the same time, you also have. It wouldn't be that different, because a lot of the jobs that exist would still be here. We would just get rid of a lot of the jobs that are superfluous, that are just meant for like BS, just to like pretend that people are better than others. And that is one of the things that I think is going to be a hurdle uh, in transitioning into a socialist society, um, grappling with the concept of equality, because I think we have an idea of there being some semblance of equality in the United States. Um, but the idea that everyone, like abolishing classes in the US, would reveal that we are not equal. If suddenly rich people had to realize that they are suddenly no better than, well, they really never have been, but they had to contend with the fact that they were losing all of the privileges that they had enjoyed. That's not going to go over well with them, and that's part of the process of all of this. That you know, it's it's a process. That's why there's a transition into communism, and I mean it's not something that's explicitly laid out in this book, but socialism is meant to be a transition into communism, um, because he alludes to it in this, but um, the difference between communism and socialism is the presence of the state, and the role of the state is to oppress a particular class in society, because like he explains in part of the last chapter, that the role of the state is to oppress the one of the classes in society, and basically they serve one class, the ruling class, and oppress the opposing class, the working class. And we see this all the time. I mean, today is June 19th. June 19th. This week, June 19th, 2021. This week, it was revealed that through a ProPublica leak, or an article that was published on ProPublica, that I think most of the 25 richest billionaires don't pay taxes. You're telling me that the people who are most capable of paying for the needs of society are most avoiding their civic duty to meet those needs, to pay for those needs. And it's perfectly legal. It's perfectly legal. They're not going to go to jail for that. But if Joe Schmo, middle class person, gets caught for tax avoidance, he'll go to jail for that. Even if it's only a couple $1,000s, he'll go to jail. As opposed to these guys who probably should be giving millions, if not billions, of dollars of their wealth, and nothing. While we have a inefficient, to put it mildly, healthcare system, crumbling infrastructure, it speaks very poorly to, it is exactly what is described in what we're reading, that we have a government that serves the interests of the ruling class. They don't want to pay taxes. They're not going to pay taxes. They write the laws so that they don't have to. But again, these are the people who are making the decisions in how we spend most of the time during the day. These are the people who are deciding whether we do anything about climate change, whether we're going to have a future as a species. These are the people who are deciding very important things about the future of our society and about our species. And that is why it is important to read these texts, to study Marxism, and to not be shy about it. I mean, it would behoove us to talk to our friends and family about these concepts, because it's not like things are getting any better. And it's not like things are going to get any better without us becoming more conscious about our place in society and about what it's going to take for us to see the changes that that are needed for us to finally see a transformation in the means of production. So with that, I'll end it here, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.